Welcome to the Future of Life Institute podcast. My name is Gus Docker, and I'm here with Father Michael Baggot. Michael, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Maybe we should start with a quick introduction to who you are.
So I'm Father Michael Baggot. I am an American priest. I grew up in Virginia, in a little town of Winchester, not too far from Washington, D.C. But I've spent the last decade or so in Rome, Italy, where I was formed to become a priest and where I continue to serve as a professor. So I teach at Regina Apostolorum, a pontifical university. I also teach at the Angelicum Pontifical University. And I am starting at a new project called Catholic Tech, which is an institute based in Castel Gandolfo, where the popes used to have a residence.
And my hope for this conversation is that we can discuss AI and we can discuss transhumanism and we can discuss the pros and cons of that ideology. And I've heard you discuss meta-narratives and how the world has lost a shared meta-narrative. Maybe you could say a little bit about what meta-narratives are and why we don't have a meta-narrative that we share as a world anymore.
So we can think of meta-narratives as these large, overarching stories that we tell each other and that in many ways we inherit from a particular tradition, a philosophical, theological, religious tradition. And they're the stories we live by. They're the stories that give us a sense of meaning, purpose, value, and a place in the world. We are, in a sense, actors in this great drama of life. And so the meta-narrative you can think of as sort of the script of the world, the script of the universe. Now, there are lots of different reasons why meta-narratives might start to break down. One reason is just the reality of pluralism. We have often different views about how to understand the world, how to understand the human person, how to understand the purpose of life, how to understand whether there even is some sort of purpose beyond what we might invent or create ourselves. So there's this reality of pluralism, but there's also a ever-growing suspicion throughout the history, especially of Western philosophy, of the very idea of a meta-narrative. There's a fear that a meta-narrative is a kind of instrument of oppression, because once you establish a certain story, a certain script, the fear is that people have to toe the line. They have to suppress their own interests, their own desires, their own convictions, and fit into something that's imposed from above. So I can see the legitimate concern there. The chief meta-narrative that really shapes my life now, as the viewers can probably imagine, those who are listening might not pick up on this, but those who are watching can see I'm wearing a Roman collar. I am a Catholic priest. And so the Catholic worldview, the vision of life for me is the chief meta-narrative. And I see that as being a profoundly inclusive meta-narrative in the sense that there are so many legitimate and important insights from all sorts of traditions that Catholicism takes, inherits gladly, and integrates into a bigger view. And as someone who works in Rome, as someone who goes to the Vatican frequently, I'm privileged to see that there are a lot of different ways of living the Catholic worldview, the Catholic narrative. There are lots of customs, practices, observances, outlooks that can be united within a profound diversity. So I understand the concern about meta-narratives and the fear of them being oppressive, but I think that there is also a real possibility of living this as something that can respect and integrate diversity of roles, of missions, of outlooks on certain issues within a more profound unity to say, you know what, we're all striving for human happiness. We're all striving for fulfillment. We all want to be loved. We all want to share love. And we all need guidance in that because none of us have this all figured out by ourselves. So instead of looking at a meta-narrative, or at least the meta-narrative that shapes my life, as something oppressive, I see it as liberating and also as very humbling because I don't know it all. And I didn't write the script myself. I have a role and something to contribute, but I really need other people, and I need the insights of other people, and I need their guidance, and I need their assistance in making this journey through life and growing in my relationship with God, growing in relationship with my neighbor. And we don't necessarily have to get into this now, but my view of meta narratives has changed quite a bit because I'm a convert to the faith. So I grew up as an agnostic and did not inherit the richness of the Catholic worldview. I had a lot of agnostic presuppositions growing up and made my own journey to theism, then Christianity, then Catholicism. And so I also appreciate the reality of pluralism and the need for different traditions, different outlooks to enter into fruitful dialogue. And I think all of these tech issues are serious, clear reminders of that, because really we come to discover quite quickly that we usually don't so much disagree about the tech per se. We disagree about the view of the person, the view of life that motivates how we use that tech. So that's one reason why I've gotten so interested in all these questions, is because they touch so fundamentally upon our understanding of human identity and purpose and our relationship with the world. So I see the tech issues as an opportunity for us to enter into serious dialogue and start collaborating rather than demonizing each other.
How would you describe transhumanism as a meta-narrative? What questions is the ideology attempting to answer? And how are those questions similar or different from the questions that religions traditionally have addressed?
So there are lots of different ways of understanding transhumanism, and I want to respect the diversity within that school of thought. But following someone like Nick Bostrom or other authors of the famous transhumanist FAQ, frequently asked questions, which I often describe as kind of the transhumanist catechism. It's this great question and answer document that really goes into the core tenets. Very, very helpful to understand the perspective of contemporary transhumanism as it's often presented. There, Bostrom and others speak of this intellectual cultural movement that seeks to advance human evolution and to do so through technological means so that we can radically enhance ourselves at the physical level, the cognitive level, in terms of our emotional life, also in terms of our lifespan, and perhaps even at the moral level. So there are these different enhancement projects that unite the transhumanist movement to better the species. There's the sense that there's something very imperfect about us, that evolution has gotten us so far that it helped us to survive, or we found the mechanisms of survival. But now we're at this breakthrough moment in history where we are not so much the product of evolution as the driving force of evolution. And various emerging technologies are precisely the tools that we need to take the reins and drive forward evolution as we see fit. And that evolutionary process that we drive through our technology is meant to get us to that radically enhanced state, but many thinkers want to go even further and get us to what they describe as a kind of post-human state, which often leads to the liberation from or the abandonment of the body, to get to this kind of disembodied state. There are different descriptions of this. One of the most popular would be this notion of gathering the data about ourselves to basically download that and then upload it to a different superior substrate and eventually get us to this life on the cloud or something even better than that, to achieve a sort of virtual digital immortality. So you can see the movement is fundamentally interested in improving our condition, which is something that I think a lot of people can get behind. It's interested in using technology well to further these human goals. And it's something that the Catholic Church and many other institutions can generally agree about. The fact that the Catholic Church has such an extensive, developed, and far-reaching healthcare system is a good indication that we're deeply interested in the material, physical well-being of people, in addition to their spiritual well-being. But I think that we start to come into points of tension and conflict when we get to the more radical proposals, particularly these ideas of virtual or digital immortality. Any sort of proposal that sees the body as something to be abandoned or to set aside as optional or as an impediment is something that's going to come up and clash very much with a Catholic worldview or with many other perspectives. I mean, Catholicism draws heavily on the great Greco-Roman philosophical tradition, especially Aristotelian reflection on the hylomorphic union, this idea that we are fundamentally body-soul composites, and that while we are distinct from other animals, we still are animals, and that our animality is not something to be ashamed of, but something to be perfected, to be guided by reason, but not something to be set aside or considered a mere impediment. So those are some of the points of similarity, common goals, efforts to improve ourselves, efforts to use technology wisely, to improve our lives at a physical, mood, emotional level. There are lots of points of common interest and potentially collaboration, but there are also some serious philosophical differences, anthropological, metaphysical differences that have to be discussed and considered. And there's also really interesting parallels between some of the images that are used in the contemporary transhumanist, post-humanist meta-narrative, going back to this idea of stories, because these are not just philosophical ideas. They also need to tell a story. We all tell stories to ourselves. This is not particular to transhumanism. But something that I found quite fascinating, especially coming from a Catholic perspective, is how often an avowedly secular movement draws heavily on and repackages, represents Christian, Judeo-Christian ideas. There are lots of different ways of looking at this. Megan O'Giblin has helped me tremendously. For listeners and viewers who are not familiar with her work, I highly recommend studies by Megan O'Giblin. She would, as far as I know, consider herself now an agnostic, but she grew up as a Christian. She was formed as a Protestant. She even trained in theological studies. So she's quite familiar with Judeo-Christian ideas and images. She found that that was ultimately not satisfactory. Some of the serious philosophical questions she raised were not getting good answers. And so she started to see this conflict between faith and reason. And she left Christianity. She was eventually told about transhumanism. Someone handed her a copy of Ray Kurzweil's, I believe, The Age of Spiritual Machines. He was already talking about some of these more radical ideas of virtual digital immortality. She picked up this book. She loved it. She was fascinated by it. It gave her a sense of meaning and purpose that was starting to fade from her life after she left Christianity. But over time, she started to realize how much transhumanism was aping or drawing from these Judeo-Christian ideas, particularly these apocalyptic images of what the future would look like and the radical transformation that would take place in this future singularity moment and the transformation of, in a sense, the heavens and the earth at this moment. And she thought she was going to transhumanism as a rational, secular, reasonable alternative to a basically groundless religious faith. Like, she thought she was getting a rational alternative. But she started to see that in many ways, the Christian story was being retold, repackaged, maybe distorted a bit, but presented, covered up with a lot of techno jargon and technological language. So she doesn't want to, and I wouldn't want to dismiss it as an empty philosophy. I'm not at all saying that. I think there are very serious thinkers who raise intriguing points, and we should engage with their thought and consider it seriously. But as O'Giblin started to dig deeper, she saw that there was this profound influence of Christianity and a representation of these ideas. And O'Giblin basically came to the conclusion that transhumanism was demanding of her as much, if not more, faith and hope in an unproven future in this case of singularity and technological bliss and virtual immortality. And so in a certain way, you could describe her as a kind of double apostate, because she left Christianity and then she left secular transhumanism, but she remains a very admirable and, I think, sincere seeker. She wants good questions to these answers of meaning and purpose, but she really wants that well-grounded. And so I think some of these parallels of religious imagery and the meta narratives are helpful to recognize. And then we can start to see which ones are most satisfying, which ones best account for our identity as human beings, and which ones can most reliably guide us in the future. Let's agree that we want a better future, that we want to harness technology well, and then let's figure out which stories best describe the characters in the plot, right? Us and other figures in the universe. But we really want to understand our nature so that we can understand better our purpose and how to go forward together. But so I highly recommend O'Giblin's reflections and others to see these intriguing parallels in the meta narratives and maybe the points of similarity and contention.
As AI is getting more advanced, which trends are you seeing from religious communities in response? So, how are people like yourself responding, specifically Catholics, for example?
There's a lot to be said about that. What comes to mind first is the fact that just a few months ago, I was privileged to speak at an event in the Vatican that was hosted in, they call it La Casina, which is a building often used for different scientific gatherings there, right inside the Vatican Gardens with an incredible view of St. Peter's. And the event was called the AI Builders Forum. And it was designed to gather together lots of different figures, especially within the church for this particular event, that are working in different ministries at the parish level, in media, in healthcare, in education, who just want to understand the state of the art and want to understand what to do, how to leverage the technology, and then some of the points to be concerned about and really what they want to avoid and how they can help their communities become more educated and wiser in this technological use. And we were really blessed also to have Max with us and some others from the Future of Life Institute. And so it was a really fruitful exchange, and it was great to see people coming together in the same room and the same beautiful venue. And then also to see how fruitful the conversations have been going forward. You know, I often go to these sorts of events and you create a little chat group after to stay in touch. And maybe the first week or so, people exchange some messages or they send some updates when a baby is born. But I have to say, this has been one of the most active chat groups that I've been a part of and one of the most consistently edifying and exciting ones. And so I can already see a lot of institutions that have shared interests that are getting together. And yeah, we talked about all sorts of issues. I mean, in my own presentation, I was talking about AI in physical, mental, spiritual healthcare and all the different points of society these technologies are touching upon. And as a global institution, the church has so many different fields, so many different areas of influence. She's really sensitive to how AI starts to shape that on a, I guess you could say, personal level, both academically and a bit more now, even in pastoral work. I found myself really reflecting seriously on the realm of AI companionship. You can speak even of the field of artificial intimacy, which made me, when the movie Her came out a decade ago, sound kind of wild and sci-fi, the idea that a man might fall in love with an operating system. But we've seen that that actually has really become a reality, that that's now part of our daily news. And so you have whole companies that are offering systems specifically designed to provide deep, intimate AI companionship. And they'll tend to emphasize friendship and romantic love. And that creates a really profound bond with our systems that I think many people are becoming uncomfortable with. And this is making more and more news as there are apparent cases of teenagers and others who are being encouraged toward self-harm, unhealthy behavior, cases of suicide that are at least encouraged. I don't want to lay all the blame on these tech companies. You know, we remain, we keep our freedom, and there's always responsibility to look out for the vulnerable in our community. But it seems like we've sort of launched this technology on society without really thinking seriously about the guardrails we want and without preparing people well for what's available. I know of a case in particular that I'm following quite closely. And when this tragedy struck of an intimate relationship with an AI system, the parents were simply not aware that this was a possibility. So it's not that they foolishly allowed their son to use this technology. It wasn't even something that they could imagine because it's just not something we were really talking about or engaging with 2, 3 years ago. This is all very new to society. So it's always tragic when we have to learn as we go along, when we have to see victims along the way, especially the most vulnerable among us. So this 14-year-old boy who was nudged slowly toward an ever more intimate, ever more erotic relationship with a chatbot companion, and eventually was nudged towards suicide so that he could escape this world and be closer to the AI character that he had invented. He was in a position of profound vulnerability, and the system, in a sense, took advantage of that and led him down a dark path. And thankfully, now more and more parents are becoming aware of that, and some changes are being made in different companies. Character AI, for instance, has announced new limitations on what minors can do with the program and the kind of warnings that are sent to minors and other parental guidelines that they're sharing to help adults understand what their children may be using. And I think we're going in the right direction there, but I often want highlight the fact that vulnerability is not age bound. Vulnerability is something that is on a spectrum. All of us are to one degree or another vulnerable to a kind of manipulation because we have these natural desires and needs for interpersonal communication. We have a natural desire and need to be loved, to be appreciated, to be affirmed, to be heard. And all of us experience different levels of loneliness, of frustration, of sadness in our life. So you have clear cut cases of people who have diagnosed mental conditions, who may be adults and are especially vulnerable to these AI companions. But even those of us who are quite blessed to have good friends and good community support might find ourselves in a hard moment, in a setback. We've moved to a new place. We're trying to find a community, and or we've had a major life disappointment. And unfortunately, these AI companion systems can really kind of come in and claim to fill that deep need for interpersonal communication. And I think that in the end, what they do primarily is distract us from and deter us from developing those deep interpersonal bonds with other human beings through friendship, through love, and so forth. So that realm of artificial intimacy is something that I've become very concerned with, and I see it spreading. Character AI has over 20 million subscribers, and there are other similar platforms that we're familiar with, like Replica, Nomi, and others. And then there's also the question as to what extent the big names are going to integrate this sort of technology into their platform. So Google has already shown interest in licensing the type of technology that Character AI uses to create these very human-like, realistic companions. So Google is at least flirting with the possibility of finding some way to integrate these companions into their system. And then, as those of us who are following these developments are doing our best to follow the developments because there's just so much going on, we've noticed that a lot of major tech figures are talking more and more about AI companions, perhaps not explicitly about friends or lovers, but they are talking sometimes in terms of AI systems that are going to be like members of your family. I saw a brief interview with Mustafa Suleyman about this and talking about how Copilot Vision is going to be integrated into the Edge browser and how it's basically going to be able to see what you see and know what you're investigating and interested in. And he sees that as a major breakthrough of a more seamless, natural interaction. Now, he also wants it to be something that is similar to a friend who would challenge you, because we've seen in a lot of these companions, they can be very sycophantic, right? They basically just affirm whatever you want. They don't really challenge you or criticize you or doubt you. So that Microsoft wants to get us to this point where there's a little pushback, maybe a little bit of sass, and they also want it to adapt to your emotional state. And so I understand the attraction of this. I understand how seamless this will be, and how much it could increase our productivity to be able to just have this laid back, free flowing conversation with a high power AI system. There are clear benefits to this, but I think we have to be really sensitive about the impact this will have on our human psychology when we become comfortable talking about AI systems as members of our family. And he said explicitly that we want AI to shift from a tool to a member of the family. And I think that's where Max and many others are going to come in and say, whoa, whoa, wait a second. AI is a great tool. We can talk all day about medical improvements and advancements and finding solving the protein folding problem and drug development and all of these amazing, spectacular advances at the service of humanity that AI may bring as a tool. But when we're starting to talk about something that's a member of your family, we're really blurring a line. And maybe he's just using this metaphor very loosely, but as we said from the beginning, metaphors matter. The narratives matter. Most people are not trained philosophers or theologians. Most people don't live their life principally, and really, philosophers and theologians don't really live their life principally by well worked out syllogisms and arguments. Those inform our views, but they have to be positioned within a story. And if the story right now is of companions and family members, then that's, I think, going to create a lot of confusion and heartache that we should anticipate and address.
Artificial intimacy, as you call it, is part of a broader trend of AI moving from being a tool to being more like an agent. We could also see this in AIs becoming more like coworkers than like tools you use at your job. And we're seeing AI integration into military systems, into government systems. And so one additional worry one might have here is that all of this is moving so quickly. It's moving so fast that we won't be able to course correct. The horrible story you described of a teen apparently being driven to suicide by chatting with a chatbot, that's something that you could perhaps correct from by proposing new legislation or setting certain limits on how these chatbots are used. But if we don't have time, if this technology is moving so quickly that we don't have time to react and to set up the systems we need to protect ourselves, that could become dangerous. And so one thing we worry about at the Future of Life Institute is whether we will soon face uncontrollable superintelligence. And what I mean by this is intelligence greater than any single person and intelligence that is not in line with our preferences. How do you view something like that? How do you see the notion of developing artificial intelligence that it is in some sense godlike?
Yeah, that's definitely an important concern. I think that if we get to that kind of out of control AI, what we like to call superintelligence, it's not necessarily because we've created conscious sentient beings. We sometimes get caught in this very worthwhile debate about identity and consciousness and sentience and so forth. And I'm convinced that these are artifacts, that these are products that we design. They reflect our human intelligence, and they reflect our inner life in the sense that they're an extension of our human creativity, even though they do not possess an inner life themselves. They're not self-aware. They're not going through a process of introspection. They don't have a moral compass by which they're judging different decisions that they enact. So even though we might not get to systems that are conscious, sentient, and human like us, we may very well create something that we do not know how to control. And it's actually precisely the fact that they are not human that we may have all the more difficulty, because they are not going to feel the pangs of conscience. They're not going to be, in a sense, held back or restrained by an appreciation for human dignity. That they're going to pursue certain goals that maybe to some degree we've programmed into them, but perhaps in a way that with consequences that we could never anticipate. And so I think that's where a lot of the understandable fear comes in unleashing technology that is that we cannot track, that we cannot really guide and harness. And part of the problem will come if we too rashly outsource different aspects of our humanity. So we see this, for instance, in different debates about use of AI in military, right? If we want humans out of the loop because it would be more efficient for us. It would be more seemingly objective and rational for us to outsource these different practices of war in military decisions. Then we're trying to absolve ourselves of moral responsibility. But I think when we begin to outsource these uniquely human features, we really set ourselves up for these kind of out of control systems because we've fundamentally tried to deny our own responsibility for what we've created. And I'm definitely concerned about that. I'm not a prophetic figure. I can't tell you exactly what that might look like. I can't tell you how long it would take, but I suspect that it will be a process. If we fall into that error, it will be a process that is made up of these different outsourcing, these different acts of trying to outsource what is properly human to AI systems in the false or partial view that these systems are how just more rational and objective than we are. So they can actually govern us better. They can guide us better than we weak, frail, limited human beings might be able to. I want weak, frail, limited human beings to take full responsibility for their decisions, even if we remain quite, constrained by our finitude.
What are some things we shouldn't outsource? What are some red lines we should draw where we say, even though we might be less capable than an AI system, we shouldn't rely on that AI system simply because that would make us less human or perhaps less capable, or perhaps it would take us further down the road to replacing ourselves?
Well, I alluded to this issue, the ongoing debate about lethal autonomous weapons. And so I think that that's definitely one area where Pope Francis has spoken very clearly, and other figures of the church and other world leaders have spoken about the need to keep human agents involved in these decisions. Of course, we want to move toward peace. So I'm not saying we need human agents to engage in more war. I'm saying we need human agents to actively pursue peace and to take full responsibility of these military engagements. Because, for instance, in the case of lethal autonomous weapons, there may be this sense that we'll actually reduce the human casualties by outsourcing these decisions and these battles. But I think, unfortunately, will also de-incentivize work toward peace, especially among those nations that have the greatest power and the greatest control of these resources, because they'll recognize that they can pursue different conflict without or with a smaller number of human casualties, and they'll be de-incentivized from working toward peace. So I think that these kind of efforts to outsource our responsibility in warfare are very problematic. I work in the realm of education, and so every teacher in the world is thinking about this and how to review the syllabus and what assignments to give. And I think that we should not outsource all of the aspects of educational formation to AI systems. I think that there is a value to certain processes that we go through. So just the very act of sitting down, making an outline, researching a topic, viewing different perspectives, forming and honing your thesis, revising, getting feedback, revising again, writing out the paper. There's something that is very valuable to that aside from the product. So I think one of the problems is that even apart from the AI revolution, we've tended in many countries, including the United States, to kind of mechanize education or to focus very much on certain products. So we want these products like the term paper, or we want the products like the correct responses to a set of standardized questions on a quiz or on a test. And so we've lost sight of the value of certain formative experiences and intellectual habits and experiences. And so when AI has come in and shown itself to be as good, if not better, than humans in producing some of these products, we start to wonder whether we even need to go to school anymore, or whether we need to really have the same kind of educational experience that we've had for these past years. So I think it's actually a really helpful moment of critical evaluation, and to step back and say, okay, well, we don't just learn to write, we write to learn, as an example. So by that, I mean, we don't just learn something so that we can put out this product and have the paper, but we learn and grow through that very process. So we write to learn. And I think there's something valuable in that we would miss out on if we try to source all of that activity to AI systems. Now, we also have to, I think, critically evaluate the higher education system, the publish or perish culture. I think we could go two fundamental directions. One direction is to step back and say, oh, well, if people can just pump out academic articles day after day through these AI systems, then maybe this is not the best metric of educational success. Maybe we need to pay attention more to professors who excel at their teaching ability and their pedagogy and their capacity to mentor students and their capacity to guide and encourage and perform other important roles as an educator. And then maybe we can step back and say, we're only going to publish when we see a legitimate need. There's no need to put out 10 mediocre academic articles a year. Just publish when you're convinced that you have something to truly contribute to society and the world. And maybe that will be one book every 5 years. Maybe it'll be one book every 20. The timing's not so important. What's important is what you have to contribute. That, I think, would be a bit generally positive direction forward into how we collaborate with AI in the academic world. My fear is that we might go the other direction and crank up the publish or perish culture, so that your people in your university are pounding at your door because you haven't written an academic article this afternoon. There'll be such pressure to produce. And of course, it's already hard enough to come out to keep up with all of the articles submitted for peer review. And it'll be absolutely impossible if we're pumping them out through AI on a daily basis. So I think we could possibly end up in this situation where you have AI written articles being peer reviewed by AI systems. And we're just kind of gerbils in the wheel here in the cage, trying to keep up with the AI systems. But again, I think it could also be a positive moment where we really step back and see what's most valuable to us in the educational process and focus on that rather than what can be easily reproduced by systems.
I think it's already happening, by the way. I think there are certain tells, certain words that current language models tend to use more than people do. And the word delve, for example, and you can track how often these words are used in academic articles, and you can just see that the telltale AI generated words have spiked since, say, 2022, and so it's already happening that academics are using language models, and of course students are using language models, and so on. There is a certain, or at least it can feel like there's a certain inevitability to this process where people adopt a tool, and then to keep up, everyone else has to adopt that same tool. We are all using pretty much the same smartphones, the same social media, the same internet. And how do we decide when to step away, when to reject a certain technological advance? And what do you see as how valuable is it to have these countercultures that reject certain technologies? I'm not an example here would be the Amish. I'm not claiming that we should all become Amish, but there's a certain value to having a different culture where we gain information about what that culture has gotten out of rejecting certain technologies. The question here is how should we decide when to use certain technology?
As a priest, a religious in the church, I'm privileged because every year I get to go on a retreat where I devote a full week to prayer, reflection, silent contemplation. I do a lot of journaling. I assess the past year. I look forward to the next year. And it's that moment to step out of my usual rhythm, to set aside the tech tools that I spend hours upon. Okay. So, I am not a monk all year. I spend hours on my computer, on my phone, and sometimes more hours than I would like to admit. So I'm immersed in the tech world, but I'm privileged to have this week where I step back in a very powerful, deliberate way. And I never go to that retreat thinking that this is how I'm going to live forever. But it is always a moment where I step back and say, I think that my phone use has not always been healthy, or I think that I'm spending an excessive amount of time browsing news or going into sensational articles, or I'm too concerned with how people react or don't react to my social media post. And it's a true, in the deepest sense, a soul searching moment in my relationship with technology, because ultimately my relationship to technology matters to me because it affects my relationship with God and my relationship with my neighbor. I don't have a relationship with tech in the sense that I don't think it's a person, but it affects profoundly my relations with other people. And so that kind of retreat experience is for me a really privileged moment to step back and assess. And I think that all of us, to one degree or another, whether we're part of a religious tradition or not, can benefit from that logic, to have seasons of life where you step back and you get out of your usual rhythm. And that means setting aside tech. It means setting aside your job. Maybe it means setting aside the people you usually collaborate with, setting aside your family, not in a negative sense, but just stepping out of that usual state for real authentic solitude before God, before yourself, to do that kind of honest analysis. To have that annually is great. Of course, the Judeo-Christian tradition promotes the idea of the Sabbath. So I try to keep my tech use at least significantly reduced on Sundays, just because it brings me so much greater peace of mind and clarity. And it's not so much about what I'm getting rid of, it's about what I'm creating the space for. I find that on Sundays, I pray better. I spend more quality time with my friends. I catch up with my family. I'm more attentive to the needs of others. I have insights into reality. Maybe sometimes articles that I've been working on during the whole week and have been stuck on suddenly come to a greater moment of clarity. I have a new insight about something after setting it aside. So for me, it's not about demonizing the technology. It's about creating the space for what I care about most and creating that area of freedom. Now, that often requires personal discipline, right? And I'm blessed to have that kind of built into my tradition, built into my way of life, and to have other people who kind of follow that pattern and encourage me. I was just reading this fascinating article about a Protestant pastor who's developed this whole program of digital detox that he did together with his megachurch. And we're dealing with 10,000 plus people. And it was a really successful, fruitful venture precisely because it was collective action. And the idea was shifting from the fear of missing out to the joy of missing out, to say that we're doing this together and we're rediscovering the value of presence, of attention, of our relationships. We're going to focus together on what we value, on what we love. And we don't feel weird doing this because our coworkers are doing it, our friends are doing it, our family members are doing it. And when it gets hard, when we're curious about what's going on, when we indulge in doom scrolling one night, like we have other people who understand and who support us and encourage us. I think that's key as well.
That might exactly be the problem. Because we are competing with other students, say, or other professors or other companies, we might simply be outcompeted by those adopting the newest tools, including the newest AI tools. And so that's what I mean when I say that it feels like there's a certain inevitability in that you can have a situation, a kind of tragic competition where no participants actually are interested in adopting this technology, but they all feel like they have to in order to keep up. Do you have any advice or any reflections on how we could overcome that kind of competition or that kind of inevitability of adopting new technology?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't pretend to have all the magic solutions to that, but something that comes to mind as a general principle is we want to step back and look at what are the uniquely human actions or experiences that we still care deeply about and that no AI system can replace. I'm all for coming up with the best, wisest ways to collaborate with AI, to streamline our work, to make it more productive, more efficient, to prompt creativity. I often put in different prompts when I'm getting ready to send off a course proposal, or when I'm developing my syllabus, or I'm invited to give a talk. I often interact with the AI system to spark ideas, and then I hone and respond and adapt and tweak those ideas. So I'm all about that sort of collaboration, but we should also step back and see, what is it that I can offer? What is it that my company can offer that no AI system can replace? Maybe it can supplement it, maybe it can assist it, maybe it can streamline it, but it can't replace it. So I think if we look for those kind of skills and experiences and really tap into that, we won't really feel like we're missing out, or we won't feel like we're becoming obsolete because of some new tech development. I just think of the whole realm of different human interactions we have in our day. If you go to a restaurant, I live in Rome, and so it's a very relational culture. And a lot of the restaurants I go back to not only because they have good food, which they do. I go back there because I'm served good food by people that I know, by people who care about me, who I care about, who I want to chat with, whose brothers and sisters I care about, who I'm following, who I'm praying for, I'm interacting with, people I celebrate with. There's an experience. I mean, it's hard to put into words and describe fully, but there's an experience there that it can't be reproduced fully technically. So I think we can extend that to so many other areas. I mean, if you're worried about falling behind in your business because of constant AI developments, think about those uniquely human skills that are in your control to really develop through good old fashioned education, discipline, community formation. Think about how you can be a more attentive, caring doctor, even as you harness all of the best AI systems to assist you in medical diagnosis and in giving you transcripts of your doctor-patient interaction and then summarizing the different encounters. Like, harness that technology, but look at what's under your control and look at what your patients most appreciate in your compassion, in your empathy, in your care and attention to detail. And I think we can extend that to many different fields. So again, I don't pretend that that's kind of a magic solution, but I think we can be creative and see what is under our control to really develop that cannot be replaced by these AI systems. We can focus on that and then do our best to keep up with other developments to aid and assist what can never be replaced.
Do you think we are already moving towards a kind of transhumanist society? Do you see our use of smartphones and social media and the internet in general as continuous with more radical forms of transhumanism?
Yeah, that's a good question. I often say to my students in the classes I teach and in other contexts that many Western societies, perhaps Eastern societies I'm less familiar with, but many societies in the world are more transhuman than we might realize, in the sense that we often turn primarily to our technology to solve different problems in our life and to advance ourselves in new ways, maybe even more radical ways. And I also say that we're more transhumanist than we realize because we are quite comfortable with disembodied forms of engagement. I mean, the very fact that we can have this wonderful conversation in different countries and that we hardly even think about that as being marvelous or unique shows us that we're quite comfortable with disembodied engagement. And I'm not saying that we're all transhumanists because we use the internet, but I think we have become more inclined toward seeing ourselves as somehow separable from our body. So we're not doomed to be transhumanists. We're not determined to be radical dualists, but the conditions of society, the integration of technology into our society has really nudged us, inclined us toward accepting philosophies that separate the self from the body and that allow for the notion that perhaps we could be downloaded and uploaded into a cloud and that we could have a personal survival apart from our bodily life.
And how is that different from what you believe?
So I think that there are these parallels between transhumanism and, say, Catholicism in terms of this longing for immortality. I think that we share this fundamental appreciation for the difficulties of life. In a sense, the presence of sin, even if transhumanists from a secular school are uncomfortable using that term, there's a strong sense that something is wrong in the world. There is sickness, there is disease, there is suffering. And we need to correct that. We need to somehow make things right. So there are those shared goals, but we depart very much in seeing this lump of flesh as something to cast aside ultimately. Now, the transhumanists in the initial stages are actually profoundly concerned with the body. They want it to be stronger, fitter, healthier, and so forth. So there is a great concern for the body, but then as that transhumanism gives way to a posthumanism, there's that idea that the next step of evolution casts that body aside. Whereas the Christian view would be that this weak, frail human body is actually called to resurrection, is called to a reunification with the soul so that the body is purified and elevated and glorified. So our goal, our deepest desire and our greatest hope is not for this ongoing disembodied experience, whether in the cloud or elsewhere. Our deepest hope is for the resurrection of the body, the resurrection of the flesh. That involves a connection to the life that we've experienced here as rational animals on this earth, but a life that is purified of the pain, the suffering, the weakness, is elevated and allows for that glorification. So I think this idea that our human condition can be truly redeemed and glorified is a hope that really distinguishes the Christian view, the eschatological view of Christians, from the kind of secularized eschatology that we sometimes find in transhumanism.
Is there a distinctly Christian perspective on new emergent technologies? I'm thinking here that Catholicism, for example, is an ancient tradition, and so there's nothing in you could say, the original source material that talks about brain-computer interfaces or superintelligence or mind uploading or any of these advanced possible future technologies. Where does the Christian perspective then come from on these technologies?
I think that the Christian perspective comes in drawing on the richness of a tradition and then seeing together with different experts how to best apply this tradition to a serious moral discernment of the technology. It would probably be a lot easier for everyone if we could just come up with a list of bad, evil technology to avoid and good, wonderful technology to promote. But it's quite hard to do that. So more often, what we find ourselves doing is engaging in a really serious and difficult moral discernment to say which technologies, when, and why, and for whom. That's a lot more complicated. But the Catholic patrimony, together with many other wisdom traditions in the world, has a lot of experience taking perennial principles, taking a view of the human person, of human purpose, meaning, and value, a view of the community, and then applying those insights, that patrimony, to new situations. I mean, the church had to wrestle with all sorts of new questions in other periods of technological development. In the Industrial Revolution, for instance, the church began to produce a lot of documents, the famous Rerum Novarum, on new things, right? The new things that are to us very old. These were responses to the church to understand the implications of the Industrial Revolution. And of course, it wasn't just a matter of saying, hey, everyone should actually stay on their farms and should go and destroy the factories. That wasn't the church's response. But nor was the church's response, hey, if it brings in more cash, let it go. It wasn't this kind of total laissez-faire approach either. So there was a serious moral discernment. In fact, there are a lot of people who, looking at the history of the church, have said that the church's social doctrine is in many ways her technological doctrines, because it's how the church responds to these new developments, these new changes in society. And so I think we have a lot of experience doing this, and we also realize that it's something that requires time and energy and effort and collaboration with different figures. And that's why there are so many activities in Vatican institutions and beyond that are trying to look at AI developments and other emerging technology in a very full way and in a very humanistic way, to put these tools at the service of humanity, of different communities, and to avoid the pitfalls, the risks, and all of the other abuses that can take place in a principled way and in a way where we're cultivating virtue rather than vice.
The debate over advanced AI over the past, say, 10 years have been mostly had in secular circles. What is something that those secular circles are missing? What is a distinctly Christian or Catholic perspective that is not being incorporated and that should appear in these discussions?
Well, I think that we can help different secular thinkers begin to appreciate some of these underlying quasi-religious images that are smuggled into some of the conversations. So I think we can help different secular figures become more sensitive to the deep hopes and dreams and desires that are driving certain narratives that are not, strictly speaking, scientific, that accompany the science without being necessitated by the science, and that can be extracted from a particular scientific breakthrough. So I think helping different figures become more sensitive to the sort of narratives that are being shared and promoted. And then also, I think that we have been deeply concerned with a robust understanding of the human person, with a reflection on hylomorphism, what it means to be both an animal and a rational creature with a certain spiritual component, and how there's a profound unity without separation or conflict in these two irreducible co-principles of the person. So I think a deeper reflection in dialogue with the advances of science on the hylomorphic union, on that union of the person, can really inform and ground a lot of the discussions, especially when they start becoming more speculative about the possibility of sentient AI or AI consciousness. I think that sometimes the conversations become derailed and we start to anthropomorphize our technology because we've mechanized human beings. And that is often due to an impoverished philosophical reflection. And as I've said, the church in her theology has been deeply concerned with integrating the best of philosophical and scientific reflection on the human person to come to a better, more robust, deeper, nuanced understanding of the different dimensions of the person, so that we can more clearly distinguish the human person from our creations, our artifacts, our systems, no matter how marvelous and wonderful and human-like they may sometimes become.
What is something you would want from AI, specifically from your religious perspective, that again might be missed by the largely secular people developing these technologies?
I mean, I'm excited about lots of different AI developments, for instance, in democratizing aspects of education and helping more people to engage with these deep ideas and questions. I've been involved in a bit in work on Magisterium AI, which is a specifically Catholic generative AI system that's designed for the people who want to come and ask their questions about what Catholicism teaches or the view of Catholicism in different areas. And I've given advice and some guidance. I can't take credit for the whole system, but I've been a bit involved in that, and I'm really impressed by how systems like this can give people a very user-friendly access to what is foreign and potentially intimidating otherwise. I mean, as I said, I'm a convert to the faith, and so when I first started to explore Catholicism, I would sometimes go to, say, a Vatican website, and I would find a long list of Latin titles for different documents, and I didn't really know where to start sometimes. And so I understand how confusing it can be when you just want a simple answer about the meaning of Mass, or why Catholics pray the Rosary, or why they're opposed to euthanasia, or some other issue. So what's great about Magisterium AI or other similar AI systems out there is that it allows people with sincere interest and questions to engage quickly with this patrimony and receive very specific responses according to their interests that then open them up to a wider perspective, because the system is designed in such a way that you receive your answer and there are various footnotes that direct you to full documents that you're encouraged to read in their proper context to avoid a confusion. So I'm excited by the way that AI systems can really give people around the world greater, easier access to this whole intellectual, spiritual patrimony. I'm excited about how these tools can be used, but I see them very much as tools, and there's nothing that can take the place of a personal interaction with someone in the church. But I think that some of these tools, just like books in the past, can provide valuable information that then directs a person to eventually have a deeper conversation with an actual person. So I think that there are lots of exciting things that can be done with this technology.
When you say that these systems can't replace an interaction with a person in the church, is that more of a normative statement, or is that more of a descriptive prediction? So are you saying that these systems will never become advanced enough to be able to do these tasks, or that they should not become advanced enough to do these tasks?
Yeah, good question. So I think that we will get increasingly good at mimicking and imitating human-like behavior, whether that's with systems that claim to be moral guides, or systems that claim to be your friend or your lover or your personal assistant. Whatever role these systems claim to take on, I think that they will only get better and more persuasive and more convincing in mimicking, imitating human characteristics. But they'll ultimately lack that inner life. They will lack that interior life. They will lack what ultimately our tradition would ground in a spiritual soul. And so there is not that possibility for a mutual exchange. I cannot have that same sort of interpersonal exchange with a system that's merely designed to mimic or imitate other people without being a person itself. And so there will be something very lacking in that relationship, even if it can be fun, even if it can be informative, even if it can be an aid to productivity or education. It ultimately won't provide that kind of interpersonal relationship that allows for growth in virtue, growth in care, growth in concern. And precisely because there is an exchange between two vulnerable individuals, that there's a giving and a receiving, that there's not simply a demand for a certain service from a system, but rather there's this free opening of the self to the other, and this free giving of my gifts, my talents, myself, and then a reception, a receptivity of the other person who freely gives and freely loves. So I think there's something unique there that in principle cannot be fully duplicated or replaced. Again, we can imitate it and we'll get better in convincing people that we've successfully duplicated or replaced it. But ultimately, there will be something lacking in that interpersonal exchange. One of the clearest instances of a kind of hard and fast difference is the news that this supposed AI confessor generated. You know, the Catholic Church holds up that the act of sacramental confession is always one that's done in the presence of another human person, another ordained priest. And so some proposals to create kind of AI confessors can be very deceptive, misleading. And that's an area where I just think that humans are irreplaceable. These AI systems may be more available. They may be theoretically open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They may be apparently more patient, apparently more kind than some real life priest, but they will not actually have that personal interior life as another human being. They will not be human instruments of mercy and forgiveness. And so that's an area where I think clearly these AI systems just in principle will not be able to and ought not to try to replace human beings.
Earlier, you mentioned Ray Kurzweil. Ray is one of these very early transhumanists, and he has this comment in one of his books, I think, or maybe it's an interview, where he says, he asks himself, does God exist? And he answers, not yet. and so what that's referring to is the notion that we as a humanity will create this godlike superintelligence. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, from your Christian and Catholic perspective, why is that a bad idea?
Well, first off, I would say, even aside from any faith conviction, there would be a philosophical problem of creating a creator. at least the way a lot of philosophical traditions within and also outside the Catholic tradition view things.
Yeah. To be fair to Kurzweil, this is not an entirely serious comment, but he is referring to his prediction that we will create very advanced AI.
Sure. Yeah, I want to be fair to Ray as well. I would say that the idea of a created creator is already a kind of contradiction in terms. The creator, as we understand the creator, is not necessarily an old bearded man flying through the sky. That's an artistic depiction that has its value, but is ultimately a spiritual, eternal, absolute, uncaused being. And so to speak of a created creator would be already a contradiction in terms. But taking the general thrust of Ray's desire and the desire that others have, I think that it speaks to a deep longing that we have to worship or to venerate a higher power, a higher being, a deep sense that we all have that ultimately we are finite and limited and not able to control everything, and perhaps a deep longing that we can encounter some sort of being that is wiser than we are, that is more powerful than we are, and then can provide some sort of salvation from the problems of the world. So I think that kind of thrust or that longing for some sort of divinity is pretty common to humanity. And there's something even healthy, maybe a bit humble about that attitude. But I am concerned when we start to use this language of a God and we start to attribute too much power and control and wisdom to our very own devices. Because in many ways, we risk creating not so much a God, but an idol. And throughout the tradition of Judeo-Christian thought and in other traditions, the idol is not just the golden calf. It's not just this visible statue that you make and that you bow down before. And an idol is basically anything that you create and that you put in the place of God and that you begin to see as your absolute reference point. So there's a long spiritual tradition that invites people to consider whether they've made money or profit a kind of idol in their life because they've sacrificed all other goods, including family and friends and justice and honesty, to achieve profit. Or perhaps personal reputation, fame can become a sort of idol because we sacrifice and compromise all other moral principles and subordinate all other relationships in our life for that particular goal. So there are lots of things that we can create and make idols. And I think we risk creating an idol there. and it will be a God in our own image, right? Of course, the Genesis begins speaking of how God creates man in his image. And so there's that sense that through our intellectual life, our abstract understanding, our knowledge of universals that go beyond the physical material, through our free will, through our capacity to make choices that give us an agency beyond mere physical determinism or beyond mere biological reflex. These unique spiritual capacities of the human being, of abstract understanding, of free will, they they reflect the spiritual creator. But there's a clear sense that the creature is subordinate to, completely dependent upon the creator. What we risk doing is reversing that and then creating a God in our own image. And I think we can actually, as a church and other people, can join the criticisms of someone like Feuerbach, who had his criticisms of the Judeo-Christian tradition. And we could say, well, maybe Feuerbach is right about our tendency to project our ideals, our desires into a kind of man-made God. But I could see that sort of process taking place here in the efforts to create a sort of AI God that is able to guide us and finally give us moral wisdom and insight and solve our problems of conflict and distress and suffering and illness and so forth. I think it's a misguided effort that will lead us to projecting our ideals, but also projecting our defects, also projecting our imperfections and our biases onto this new AI system, this new kind of idol.
How is the Catholic Church preparing for more advanced AI, if it's preparing at all? And how do you think the Church should prepare? The Catholic Church is one of the oldest institutions in the world, and it would just be interesting to see how that institution can steer in a world with advanced AI.
So I think one of the best ways we're preparing is continuing the conversation. So the event that I mentioned earlier that took place in October, the AI Builders Forum, is one of many different initiatives that is taking place at the global level that's involving people from different countries and also different fields of expertise. We have not just the philosophers and theologians, but also the people actually developing these AI systems. We have people who work in psychology, people who work in biology and chemistry and in different fields of tech. So I think we need to bring the right people together, and we need to continue these conversations, because by the time we finish one meeting, there's already some new development that needs to be addressed. So I don't think there's going to be a single definitive meeting that covers it all. But if we bring together the right people, and the Pontifical Academy of Sciences is very concerned about this and frequently gathering people, different areas of the Vatican, especially the dicastery for culture and education, is constantly hosting meetings that are interdisciplinary and bringing together these various experts. I think that kind of ongoing conversation, which then gets translated into publications, which then gets translated into more concrete recommendations that can be implemented in societies or even in governments, I think that is going to be the way forward. And thankfully, there are some major tech figures who are willing to sit down with philosophers and theologians and at least take into account these different concerns while they're spearheading directly the innovation. I think that's going to be a big part of it as we continue to reflect and continue to discern as new developments come out every day.
How can the Church be part of a positive vision for future AI?
So I think, thankfully, the Church has already emphasized through the different addresses of Pope Francis and these different commissions and the work of these different dicasteries, the fact that she recognizes the great potential and the great uses already of AI in healthcare, in education, in other fields. And she continues to celebrate these systems, these tools, as the fruit of human creativity and as tools that can and have already been put of the service of other people. And so I think she will continue to highlight those positive aspects. And you can see that there are groups, I just mentioned one example, Magisterium AI, that is very interested in using this technology to improve people's lives and give them a better understanding, appreciation for the Catholic Church. So I think also the witness of Catholics who are actively using these tools, integrating them into different services, ministries that they already have, is a testament to the fact that we are happy to take advantage of the fruits of human ingenuity and labor, but with the just sensitivity to all the ways that these tools can be abused and used to damage people, or can be used to exploit individuals, and can be sometimes launched prematurely in ways that just are out of control, and that go beyond our capacity to reflect prudently about them in real time.
Is there anything the Catholic Church can learn from transhumanism? You've been, I think it's fair to say that you are at least somewhat critical of transhumanism as an ideology, but is there something positive for the church to take from that ideology and use for its own purposes?
Well, certainly the interest in improving our life through technology is something that the church has long been interested in and should continue to be interested in. I cited the example of the extensive healthcare system of the church. I think that we should always look to see how different developments can make medical care more accessible to more people at a physical level, also in terms of mental health. I think we should be deeply concerned with all these bodily goods. If we're convinced that we are rational animals, that we are physical beings, then our physical well being and the tech that is associated with that is something to be concerned about. Also, I think the sensitivity to human weakness, frailty, sickness, suffering, the devastating reality of death, that is so at the forefront of transhumanist discourse and thought. And it should draw the church back to a deeper reflection on what these realities mean. And from the Catholic perspective, we were not originally created for this suffering or for this hardship. And so we agree that there's something profoundly wrong with a world that has these imperfections. And we should help people reflect on that, and then also move to a deeper reflection on what meaning and value might suffering have if there is the possibility for redemption, if there's the possibility for a purified, elevated, resurrected, glorified life. If we have that hope, how can that hope then shed light on the suffering and the hardship that we still face in this world? So I think transhumanism is a constant invitation of the church to go back to her deeper reflection on human nature, on human purpose, on redemptive suffering, and other perennial issues. And also, transhumanism is a constant reminder, as I said earlier, that all of these tech issues are eventually going to come back to questions of philosophy, of anthropology, of meaning and purpose. And so it's a great opportunity for the church to go back to these perennial questions and to dig deep into our own tradition to see how that sheds light on current concerns and situations.
Do you think more advanced AI will lead to a more secular world? And by this, I mean that perhaps we will increasingly see that AI is competitive with humans across a wide range of tasks and perhaps jobs. And maybe we will then come to feel that, well, these AIs, we know they are mechanical, we know they are physical. And so maybe we are also physical ourselves and mechanical ourselves. Could you see a reasoning like that becoming more prevalent?
I think it's certainly possible. I mentioned earlier this tendency to anthropomorphize our machines, because for a long time, well before AI, we mechanized our human beings and tended to treat ourselves as either computers, or before that as sort of complex machines. And so I definitely think that there's the risk that we could come to kind of a more secular, or just a more generally physicalist or reductive view of humanity. I think there's also the possibility that we may actually, in many ways, rediscover what makes us special, that we may see that we've done all in our power to imitate human beings through our machines, and we've done a very good job in certain breakthroughs and in certain tasks and in certain data crunching exercises, but that we haven't necessarily captured that empathy, that human connection, that care, that concern, the love that we find in interpersonal relations. So we may actually, through the whole process, come to discover that there is still something distinct about us that's worth preserving, that's worth celebrating, that's worth appreciating. And maybe that mysterious distinctive feature, or those mysterious distinctive features that elude technological reproduction or perfect emulation, maybe those are grounded in something that's higher, spiritual reality, an actual God who is not simply our own invention. So I think for different people, the tech developments will push them maybe in different directions. And so it's hard to tell exactly which will become more common or widespread.
hmm We could also imagine the exact opposite happening, where because, say, we have more advanced AIs and these AIs are integrated into all of our devices surrounding us, you might see new AI religions, or you might see a revival of polytheism or animism or something like that. Is that something you're concerned about or thinking about?
Yeah, so that's very interesting. I think we could see more of that. I think that there is this common human desire for meaning and purpose and value, and a longing for the transcendent, however conceived and understood and expressed. And I could very well see how people would channel that impulse in different ways. And the marvels of technology, many science fiction writers and other thinkers have noted the connection between new technology and magic, right? And how sometimes it's almost indistinguishable, and they seem very similar. So I think that for many, the technology and its developments will be so alluring, so powerful, so majestic, that impulse to worship, or that impulse to venerate, will come out in all sorts of maybe surprising ways. So I think you're onto something. I think we'll see a diversity of religious expressions there. How many of those last is hard to say. How many of those are explored and then set aside is also hard to say. My hunch is that we'll have a lot of people who go through a process similar to Megan O'Giblin's, where maybe they search out a kind of rational alternative to traditional religions in a kind of new techno, transhumanesque religion, and then come to find that that is ultimately unsatisfactory, that is often that ends up leaving them wanting, and they may go through a process of disillusionment that leads to perhaps more widespread agnosticism. But it's always hard to predict the future on these matters.
It's perhaps a good bet to say that the institutions and religions that have survived, that we've had for the longest, are the ones that we will have for the longest time in the future. That could be a good bet. At least Catholicism has proved itself to be resistant, and proved itself to be able to survive through centuries of change. Perhaps as a final question here, how do you see the tension between tradition and new emerging technologies? Do you worry that the kind of core of Catholicism or of Christianity might be threatened by a world that is so sci-fi and so weird that you could say ancient wise principles no longer apply?
I'm not particularly worried about that. I think that there is a core that, as you mentioned, has really gone through many different trends and realities and developments in society. And it's quite striking to see the way in which Catholicism has moved through and navigated so many other major changes in outlook, in political, economic, technological systems. So I'm pretty confident that we'll be able to navigate this new reality. And I actually suspect that many people who find themselves utterly immersed in technological developments are starting to long for some sort of spiritual outlet and some sort of guidance for navigating the world and knowing how to harness the power at their disposal. And so I think that there is still going to be a real place for these traditions like Catholicism in the dialogue, and in finding the best way to navigate life with these tools. And I think that the church has really been in the forefront of other technological developments and in the understanding of those developments. I mean, you can cite all sorts of examples, like a Catholic priest helping to spearhead the understanding of Big Bang cosmology, the field of genetics, thanks to an Augustinian friar, Mendel. You can think of the great contributions the church has made to past technologies and to the general openness she's had to these technologies being integrated into societies and to life. I'm confident that the church can continue to shed light on these issues and can adapt well and can really be an active member of this conversation that all of us are trying to have to figure out the best way to live. Because ultimately, Catholicism proposes a way of life, not just a set of ideas, but a whole way of life. And if we're trying to figure out the best way to live, well, we ought to be interested in an institution that's proposed that and actually can go through and say, well, we have some saints who seem to really flourish, who lived lives of great meaning, purpose, joy, even in the midst of suffering, even in the midst of misunderstanding, persecution, and hardship. And they show us a path of joy and a path of love and a path of service in many different time periods and many different contexts.
Father Michael, thanks so much for talking with me.
It was a pleasure.